We're looking at a 2,000-year-old archaeological cold case that's literally buried in the dirt of Greece. It's an active, unsolved puzzle where ancient municipal politics, a major world religion, and a few broken rocks all crash into each other. And the whole thing centers on one specific guy who may or may not have left his mark on both a sacred text and a physical city street.
The mystery kicks off in the mid-1st century AD. The Apostle Paul is writing a letter to the community in Rome, and at the very end, he just casually rattles off some greetings from his associates. Tucked right in there is this line: "Erastus the oikonomos of the city greets you." So Paul, who is writing from the Corinth area, is claiming he has an associate named Erastus holding a very specific title in the local government. For centuries, this was just a name on a piece of paper with zero physical proof, until eventually some turned up.
Before we look at that proof, we kind of need to understand the city itself. Ancient Greek Corinth was entirely leveled by the Romans in 146 BC and just sat in ruins for a century. Then, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar rebuilt it. But he didn't rebuild it as a Greek city, he built it as a strict Roman colony. Fast forward to the mid-1st century AD, and Corinth is booming. It's an absolute magnet for ambitious opportunists looking to climb the social ladder and make a name for themselves.
Let's jump to 1929 AD. Archaeologists are running a dig near the old Roman theater in Corinth. They're clearing debris from a paved square, and they hit literal rock bottom. Down in the dirt, they uncover a massive ancient limestone pavement that completely upends the narrative.
And we're not talking about some tiny, subtle commemorative plaque. This pavement installation is nearly 7 meters wide, 6.81 meters to be exact. It's made of gray limestone, and the letters carved into it are enormous, about 18 centimeters high. Originally, those deep cuttings would have been filled with flashy bronze, specifically designed to catch the sun and grab the attention of anyone walking to the theater. Whoever built this thing absolutely wanted to be noticed. The most crucial detail is the Latin text carved right into that limestone. It reads, Erastus pro aedilitates sp stravit. Translated, that means Erastus, in connection with his aedileship, laid the pavement at his own expense. Right there, carved in stone, we have a guy named Erastus living in Roman Corinth, holding public office, and dropping a massive amount of his own cash to pave a public plaza. To get why he'd do that, you have to know what an aedile actually was. In the Roman colonial system, an aedile was a seriously high-ranking municipal magistrate. You can think of them as a mix between a director of public works, a city planner, and an event promoter. They managed the streets, supervised the food supply, and sponsored the local games and theatrical performances. In Roman politics, dropping your private wealth to fund public works was the classic textbook move to gain political clout and secure your social status. So Erastus paved that plaza next to the theater because it was essentially part of his job, and it was a massive political flex.
So, case closed, right? Well, no. This is where the major scholarly headache begins. See, Paul wrote his letter in Greek, calling his associate an oikonomos, but our stone is in Latin, and the title is aedile. The big question for historians is whether these two job titles actually mean the exact same thing in the highly structured world of Roman administration.
One theory argues that yes, they match up perfectly if you look at the typical progression of a Roman career. In this model, Erastus first serves as a municipal quaestor, that's a high-ranking financial officer, which loosely translates to oikonomos in Greek. That's the job he holds when Paul writes the letter in the mid-1st century AD. Then, years later, after building up his wealth and influence, he gets promoted to the senior role of aedile. To celebrate the promotion, he pays out of pocket to pave the theater plaza. It's a clean, logical career timeline.
But other scholars fiercely push back on that, arguing it's just forcing puzzle pieces to fit. They point out that an oikonomos was usually a much lower-level clerk, and sometimes even a public slave, not an elite, wealthy politician. Also, the standard Greek translation for an aedile was usually agronomos, not oikonomos. The skeptics argue that claiming one of Paul's associates was a mega-wealthy elite dropping thousands on a bronze-lettered pavement is a huge historical stretch, especially since early Christian communities were largely at a subsistence level. And the complications definitely don't stop with the job titles. There's a massive academic fight over the exact date the stone was carved. When archaeologists found the pavement in 1929 AD, it wasn't actually sitting in its original spot. The stone blocks had been ripped up and reused as the foundation for a later wall in the late 3rd or early 4th century AD. Because of this, the scholarly world is totally split. The traditional view says the lettering style perfectly matches mid-1st century AD carvings, which lines up nicely with Paul's timeline.
But modern skeptics argue that since the stone was moved, relying on the surrounding architecture to date it is flawed. They propose the stone wasn't carved until the mid-2nd century AD, which would be way too late to be our guy.
So, if the titles don't perfectly align and the dates are fiercely disputed, we have to look at this from a totally different angle. Just how common was the name Erastus back then? If it was the ancient Roman equivalent of John or Smith, finding two guys with the same name working in local government really doesn't mean much of anything.
A scholar named Timothy Brookins actually ran the numbers on this. He built a massive database of names across ancient literature and inscriptions. And out of all of 1st century AD Greece, he found only 4 to 5 attestations of the name Erastus. Finding two men with a name that incredibly rare, both operating in civic administration, in the exact same city, around the exact same time, well, it makes it really hard to brush off as just a coincidence.
But to keep things impartial, we also have to look at another piece of dirt dug up in 1960. North of central Corinth, archaeologists found a marble plaque from the 2nd century AD detailing a dedication by a family that included a guy named Erastus. Because of its later date and its pagan context, this definitely isn't Paul's associate, but it does prove that while the name was rare, it wasn't totally exclusive to just one single person in the city. So, what does the historical evidence actually tell us when we strip away all the hype? First, the stone definitively proves a real man named Erastus existed, held the role of a deal, and paid for a massive pavement out of his own pocket. Second, the extreme rarity of the name strongly supports the idea that this could be the exact same man Paul wrote about. But, and this is a major caveat, the stone simply cannot verify the exact date it was carved, it cannot verify a flawless job title match, and it certainly cannot verify the man's religion.
Which brings us to the absolute most frustrating part of this entire cold case. We don't have the whole rock. The very first limestone slab on the far left side is entirely missing. In the standard Roman naming convention, that missing slab would have held his praenomen, his first name, and his nomen, his family name. Erastus is just his cognomen, kind of like a nickname or a branch name. Because that specific piece of rock is lost to time, we don't have his full identity, we don't know his family background, and there are 0 explicit religious markers on the surviving stone to definitively close the case.
We're left standing right on the edge of history here. We have a spectacularly rare name, a matching city, and a matching sphere of local politics. It is an incredibly compelling link between a world-famous text and a literal stone that you can go and touch today. But it really forces us to think about survivorship bias in archaeology. How much of what we confidently call history just comes down to what happened to survive the dirt? Is a missing first name on a broken rock really all that separates verified historical fact from a permanent, unsolvable mystery? Keep that in mind the next time you see an ancient artifact sitting perfectly neat and clean in a museum case.
What the Fact? Follow for more.